All Elijah Carter wanted was a quiet corner of the frontier, a patch of land where the past couldn't follow. But on a wind-torn evening, as the sun bled across the desert, an Apache woman named Nalin stepped onto his ranch with tears streaking her dust-worn face. Her presence carried the weight of danger, and her sorrow whispered of a reckoning rising beyond Elijah's fences. When she uttered the words that chilled him to the bone, he knew peace had never lived here, and never would. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Elijah Carter had built his life out of a stubborn need for silence, a low timber house, a fenced pasture, a stubborn windmill that creaked like an old prayer. On that particular evening, the sky bruised purple and gold, and the desert smelled of sun-warmed sage and distant rain that might never come. He was mending a fence post with hands that still remembered the iron of a badge when the shape appeared on the ridge, a woman, small against the horizon, her skirts plastered to dust, her hair braided and undone in places. By the time she reached the gate, she was trembling so hard the boards rattled with her breath. Elijah put down the hammer before he could think too cruel a thought. There was something in her eyes that stopped him, a rawness like a wound that had not yet scabbed. He opened the gate wordlessly and watched her stumble across the yard, one hand clutched to her chest as if to hold herself together. When she finally looked at him, tears ran black from the dust on her cheeks, and the light caught a scar on her forehead that spoke of a story older than the town. "Please," she said in a voice that scraped like a dry well, and it was neither the voice of the town nor the voice of the plains but of the land itself. Elijah led her inside, the house filling with the smell of coffee and stove smoke. He gave her a tin cup and a ration of water and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, though she would not take off her gloves. She would not tell him her name at first, only that men were after her and after the things she carried, and that they would not stop for hunger or mercy. In the kitchen light he saw at last that she was not merely frightened but hunted, the way she flinched at the creak of the door, the way her eyes flicked to the window as if expecting to see hostile faces in every shadow. When Elijah asked where she had come from, she answered with a single word that made the room tip: Apache. He felt the old memories like splinters rising beneath his skin, old maps drawn in blood, promises broken at sunrise, but the fear in her voice refused the easy judgments he might have made in town. She wiped her face with glove-smeared fingers and, with a courage that steadied her like a hand on a rail, revealed that she carried something small and heavy wrapped in cloth and leather, something tied to the bones of the land Elijah now owned. It was not gold or coin she feared for, she said, but a bone-marked fragment in the map carved upon it, a map men would kill to possess because they believed it would open a claim where no law could stand between them and riches. "They'll raise the place," she whispered, voice gone thin as the rim of the cup. "They'll tear up the graves, take the stones, sell the pieces, and when they're done there will be nothing left to remember my people by." Elijah listened while the sun bled out beyond the windows and the first stars pricked the sky. The house seemed to hold its breath. He could feel the old sheriff in him, muscled and impatient, or the tired man who'd come west to forget. He wanted to tell her to move on, to find peace elsewhere, but the world had already moved in on that option. When she looked at him, no longer merely frightened but pleading, Elijah found that the hammer lay heavy in his palm and that the silence he'd prayed for had been broken by a single truth. Peace, he realized, was not something a man could buy with acreage and quiet. It was something that could be claimed or defended, and tonight a haunted woman had put the claim in his hands. Elijah Carter sat at the rough-hewn kitchen table as the oil lamp flickered weakly against the gathering dark, and Nalin, finally steadied by water, warmth, and the simple dignity of being listened to, began to speak of things that turned his quiet homestead into a tinderbox waiting on a match. She unfolded her story slowly, voice low and careful, as if every word might summon a shadow, explaining that his ranch sat on a boundary line the government had never truly settled, a place where treaties had been written, broken, rewritten, and forgotten like wind-scrawled lines in desert sand. And though Elijah thought he owned this land fair and legal, she told him that this soil had once been medicine ground, a crossing place between tribes, sacred long before any white surveyor's compass had drawn a neat little square labeled Carter property. Elijah felt a coldness crawled his spine as she told him that men had come, outlaws, grave robbers, scavengers, the kind who hunted both relics and souls, and they were led by Boone Maddox, a name Elijah knew too well, a name sour as old blood on the tongue. For Boone was the kind of man who believed the frontier belonged to those willing to spill the most of it, a brute who'd spent years scraping the desert for anything he could pawn: silver, arrowheads, bullets, bones, entire stories of tribes shredded into trinkets for collectors who'd never set foot west of the Mississippi. Nalin's hands shook as she described how Boone's men staked claims on old camps and burial grounds, hacking apart ancient markers, burning what they could not carry, killing those who stood in their way. And Elijah noticed how her throat tightened at that last part, telling him far more in silence than she ever could in words. She explained that Boone believed the land beneath Elijah's feet hid something of enormous worth, spiritual or monetary. Neither man nor devil cared to tell the difference, and that the fragment she carried, carved with ancestral symbols and path lines, proved it, making her a threat to Boone's power and Elijah an unintended target simply by owning the land Boone had decided was his. Elijah leaned back in his chair, memories crowding him like ghosts, nights a sheriff tracking killers through mesquite groves, the taste of grit in his teeth after shootouts, the way the world had looked after he walked away from the badge hoping never to face another man's violence. But here violence had come to him like an old debt collector, uninvited and relentless. Nalin's voice softened, almost breaking, as she admitted that she had tried to warn others, tried to gather evidence, tried to protect the grounds her people had tended for generations. But Boone's men hunted her down, torching camps, threatening families, driving her across the desert until she stumbled upon Elijah's ranch at sundown. Knowing the only chance left was to find someone who would listen, Elijah felt the old world tilt, the land he had poured sweat into suddenly shifting beneath his boots. No longer a place of peace, but a marked and contested line in a story older and bloodier than his own. And as he looked at Nalin, her posture straight despite exhaustion, her eyes fierce despite tears, he realized she was not just fighting for survival but for memory, dignity, and the right for her people's dead to rest untouched. Boone Maddox, he thought, was not simply chasing a woman, he was chasing a legacy to destroy or exploit. And Elijah, whether he wanted it or not, owned the very soil Boone meant to desecrate. The lamp sputtered as a gust rattled the window, and in that trembling light, Elijah knew that peace had become a myth on this ranch, a story he'd told himself to drown out the world's uglier truths. For trouble had found him again, carved into the land like the symbols on Nalin's bone fragment. And by dawn he would have to decide whether he stood guard over this marked place or let Boone claimed it with the same brutality he had shown everywhere he rode. The oil lamp guttered low as Elijah leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose like a man trying to hold back the past with nothing but the strength of his fingertips. But the past had claws, and tonight it finally sank them in. Nalin's story stirred memories he had buried so deep he thought the desert itself had sealed them. Memories of the badge he once wore in Red Crossing, gleaming bright on the outside while carving hollow places in him on the inside. For Elijah Carter had not always been a quiet rancher far removed from the world's troubles. He had been a sheriff once, feared and respected, a man who carried justice on his hip and the weight of other men's sins on his shoulders until the day justice torn his world apart. Nalin watched him quietly, sensing the shift in him, the way his jaw tightened as if he were bracing for a blow no one could see. And Elijah finally spoke, voice low and hoarse, telling her that he had sworn never to take up another fight again, never to raise his gun for another cause, because the last time he did, a family had paid for it with their blood, a family he had personally vowed to protect. He described a night in Red Crossing when a gang led by a vicious drifter named Caleb Barron rode into town looking for a man they claimed had cheated them. And in the smoke-filled confusion of the gunfight that followed, a stray bullet, fired by Elijah himself, found its mark in the wrong place, striking the young son of the very couple Elijah had been trying to shield. The boy died in his mother's arms before dawn, and the look in her eyes, accusing, broken, hollow as the bottom of a well, had carved a wound so deep in Elijah that he hadn't felt like a man since, only a walking shell holding guilt like a furnace that never cooled. So he left the badge on the sheriff's desk, packed what little he owned, and moved west until the world forgot him, swearing that he would live quietly, harm no one, and never again trust himself with the power to decide another person's fate. Now, as Nalin finished her tale of Boone Maddox on the marked land, Elijah recognized the same storm rising that had once consumed Red Crossing, and he recoiled from it, shaking his head as if the mere emotion could push it all the way, insisting that this wasn't his fight, that he had no business standing between warring claims and outlaw greed, that he was done with bloodshed and done with choosing sides. Yet even as he spoke the words, they tasted false, because something in Nalin's trembling, something in the quiet strength beneath her fear, reminded him that men like Boone thrived not because they were strong but because good men stepped aside, hoping trouble would pass them by. Still, Elijah felt the weight of that lost boy on his conscience like a stone in his breast, whispering that stepping forward only brought heartbreak, that every life he tried to save would end in another grave, that guns answered nothing except with more graves. Nalin listened, her expression softening not with pity but with understanding, and when Elijah finally fell silent, breath unsteady and eyes fixed on some far-off place only he could see, she placed her wrapped bundle gently on the table and told him that she did not ask him to become a sheriff again, only a man willing to protect what was right. But Elijah turned away, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly his fingers whitened, because he knew that if he stepped into this fight, even for a moment, he would be stepping back toward the man he had sworn never to be, and he feared that becoming that man again might cost him more than peace, might cost him whatever was left of his soul. The night had settled thick and heavy over Elijah Carter's ranch when the first distant thrum of hoofbeats threaded through the silence like a warning carried on the wind, so faint at first that Elijah thought it might be the restless pulse of an old memory. But then Nalin stiffened, her hands freezing over the cup she held, and the dread in her eyes told him this was no ghost of the past. This was the present riding fast and without mercy. Elijah stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath his boots as he scanned the ridge, and there in the moon-washed distance he saw them, a line of riders silhouetted against the starlit sky, their horses restless, their shapes too still, too deliberate, too calculated to be ordinary travelers. And though the shadows masked their faces, Elijah recognized the posture, the swagger, the dark confidence of the man at their center, Boone Maddox, riding with shoulders loose and chin high, a vulture of a man surveying his next kill. Even from afar, Boone radiated a violence that Elijah knew better than most. For years ago, as sheriff of Red Crossing, he had nearly brought Boone in after a string of grave robberies and killings, but the outlaw had slipped through the law's grip like dust through fingers, mocking Elijah with a grin that promised they would meet again. And now, as Boone's gang set their horses just close enough to be seen and far enough to be untouchable, Elijah felt the weight of that old failure pressed down on him like a boot on his throat. Nalin moved beside him, clutching the wrapped bone fragment beneath her shawl, whispering that Boone always watched before he struck, always gave his prey a moment to feel fear settling in their bones, a moment to consider surrender, a moment to understand that running would not save them, because Boone never chased mercy, only power. The outlaw leader lifted a lantern high, its flame flickering wild in the night breeze, and though he said nothing, the message was clear as gunfire. He knew where Nalin had gone, he knew Elijah was sheltering her, and he would return to claim what he believed was his, carving a path of blood through anyone who dared stand between him and the sacred grounds he aimed to plunder. Elijah felt the burn of anger stir beneath his ribs, an anger laced with shame at recognizing the man he had once sworn to stop. And Nalin watched him as if sensing the shift, seeing that this was no ordinary fear but the awakening of a battle Elijah had spent years trying to bury. Boone's men turned their horses sharply, hooves scattering dust like sparks as they disappeared back into the canyon trail, leaving only silence, cold and heavy, settling over the ranch. But that silence carried a promise that made Elijah's heart tighten. The outlaws would return, and next time they would not come merely to be seen. He stood there long after they vanished, fists clenched, jaw locked, the old sheriff and him clawing up from the grave he had buried it in, because Boone Maddox had walked into his life twice now, and both times Elijah had been forced to face the truth that the peace he fought so hard to build was not a wall but a fragile illusion easily crushed beneath the boots of men who knew only violence. Nalin's voice broke through his thoughts, quiet but certain, telling him that Boone would bring death to the land if he was not stopped. And Elijah, staring into the dark horizon where Boone had vanished, knew that whether he wanted it or not, The fight he'd been running from had finally found him again on the very soil he called home. Inside the dim glow of Elijah's cabin, with the door barred and the night pressing against the windows like a living thing, Nalin finally unwrapped the object she had guarded with a devotion that went beyond fear, revealing a sliver of carved bone so old the edges had turned the color of desert moonlight. Elijah leaned forward, breath caught in his throat, as Nalin explained that the fragment had been taken from the remains of an ancestral guardian, a keeper of stories whose burial place lay deep within the contested land Spoon Maddox sought to plunder, and etched across its curved surface were markings, lines intersecting like riverbeds, dots where ancient fires had once been lit, spirals depicting the resting places of their people's honored dead, maps that could only be read by those raised among the stories, the songs, the sacred rites of her tribe. But Boone believed it held the keys of riches buried with the ancestors, relics and artifacts he could sell to collectors who saw history not as legacy but as currency. Elijah felt the sting of rising anger as Nalin traced the lines with a trembling finger, explaining that our people had guarded the burial sites for generations, keeping the locations secret to protect them from looters. But Boone had grown obsessed, convinced that buried beneath the stones lay silver or ceremonial weapons or talismans he could twist into proof that he had lawful claim over the surrounding land. Because with artifacts, he could argue ownership, forge documents, tell lies polished enough for officials to sign off on, and once he owned it legally, he would strip the land bare until nothing remained but empty earth and bones scattered like debris. Nalin's voice cracked as she admitted that Boone had already desecrated 2 small gravesites, tearing up sacred soil to search for valuables, and when her brother tried to stop him, Boone shot him and left his body as a warning, claiming the tribe had no right to a land they didn't use, a lie that burned in Elijah's ears like poison. For he had seen enough of the world to know how men like Boone rewrote truth to justify their violence. She confessed that the bone fragment was part of a larger ceremonial artifact once held only by the tribe's spiritual leaders, and she had taken it not to steal or hide it but to prevent Boone from using it to decipher the remaining burial sites. For once he had all the pieces, he would wield them like a weapon against her people, proving to outsiders that the tribe had abandoned their own history and thus had no rightful claim. Elijah watched her struggle with the weight of the responsibility she carried, responsibility that had cost her family, her safety, her home, and he felt the old sheriff rise again inside him, not with a fury of vengeance but with the ache of justice long deferred. Nalin's hands shook as she wrapped the bone back in its leather and cloth, whispering that if Boone obtained it, he would destroy everything her ancestors had left behind, turning sacred ground into a marketplace, memories into trophies, bones into bargaining chips. And though she had run across deserts and through canyons to protect it, she could run no farther, for Boone's reach stretched long and ruthless. Elijah swallowed hard, hearing the echo of his own past failures in her desperation. And though he had sworn off fighting, sworn off bloodshed, sworn off the man he used to be, he realized that standing aside now would make him complicit in Boone's desecration, allowing the outlaw to carve up the land like a butcher through flesh. So he forced himself to meet Nalin's gaze and saw in her eyes not only fear but a plea for someone to stand with her, someone who understood what it meant to carry the weight of the dead. And in that moment Elijah felt something shift inside him, like earth giving way before an oncoming flood, for he knew the burden she carried was no longer hers alone. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. Alright then, let's get back on the trail. For a long while after Nalin wrapped the bone fragment again, silence held the cabin like a vice, the kind that squeezes a man's breath thin until he feels the edges of a choice he does not want pressing in from all sides. And Elijah Carter paced the narrow floorboards with the stiff gait of a man twice his age, one hand dragging through his hair while the other hovered near the pistol on his belt as if torn between drawing it or throwing it out the window to avoid becoming the sheriff he once was. Nalin watched him with that steady, mournful patience of someone who had learned that hope was a fragile thing easily crushed, and though she said nothing, her eyes followed him as if she sensed that the outcome of his wrestling match with himself would decide her fate more surely than Boone Maddox's bullets. Elijah stopped at the window, staring out across the moonlit pasture where the grass stirred like restless ghosts, and he thought of all he had tried to build out here. Quiet mornings, slow days, the rhythm of chores that left no room for old nightmares, and he felt that life slipping from his grip the moment Boone's silhouette appeared on the ridge, a reminder that some men were born to destroy whatever peace others tried to build. He pressed his fists against the windowsill, shoulders tight, telling himself he had nothing, that he had no right stepping into a conflict older and more sacred than he could ever comprehend, that siding with her would mean war with Boone, and war with Boone meant blood, and blood meant he would be dragged back into the very world he abandoned. Yet even as he tried to justify stepping aside, the truth gnawed at him like the slow bite of frost, that if he turned Nalin out, if he sent her away under the pretense of neutrality, he would be handing her a death sentence as plainly as if he pulled the trigger himself. He remembered the fear in her voice when she spoke of her brother, the weight of responsibility she carried, the weight her hands trembled over the carved symbols that represented generations of her people's history. And suddenly he saw not a stranger but a lone soul trying to protect something precious in a land that treated her ancestors like obstacles, not honors. Elijah exhaled hard, the sound more like defeat than resolve, and turned back to her, saying her name quietly before he told her, carefully, reluctantly, as though each word cost him a piece of the peace he'd clung to, that he would help her, but only for a short while, only until she reached her people or found a way to stand safely beyond Boone's reach, because he could not, become the sheriff again or let himself be dragged back into a fight that might dredge up the man he once was, a man who had already cost a child his life. Nalin's eyes softened, though sorrow and gratitude mingled there, and she nodded with the gravity of someone who understood that every alliance came with conditions, that trust was not a luxury Elijah could offer freely. He laid out the boundaries with the steady cadence of a man building a fence post by post. He would offer shelter for the night. He would help her find safer ground. He would keep the bone fragment hidden until they knew Boone's next move. But she must not ask him to take up a badge, to lead a charge, or to fight a war that rightfully belonged to her people. Still, even as the words left his mouth, Elijah felt the uneasy prickle of doubt because he knew Boone would not abide by boundaries, would not politely stop at the edge of Elijah's land simply because a man wished to remain uninvolved. And when Nalin met his gaze with quiet certainty and said, "Temporary alliances still change destinies," he felt a cold truth settle into his bones. The moment he agreed to help her, even with terms and limits, he stepped into Boone Maddox's path, and men who stepped into Boone's path rarely walked away unchanged. Night fell heavy over Elijah Carter's ranch, a blackness that swallowed the horizon and left only weak lanterns to wrestle with the dark while Elijah and Nalin sat alert, rifles across their knees, listening to animal sounds and the subtle creaks of a place that had carried many feet and secrets. They had latched the doors, bolted shutters, and set low lanterns to hide movement. The old hound was restless beneath the porch, and the ranch held a quiet like a held breath. The first sign of trouble came as a deliberate thud against the north fence, a sound that belonged to men testing property lines, and Nalin's body tightened as if struck. Elijah moved to the window without show, watching the ridge where riders ghosted against starlight, the old sheriff's instincts settling into place despite years of trying to bury them. A lantern bobbed on the ridge and a rider rode forward to call Boone Maddox's name, a taunt meant to be heard rather than to negotiate. Elijah answered in a hard, controlled voice that this was private land and they would be expected to leave, because sometimes steadiness unravels a bully more surely than a bullet. But the outlaws came in with a rush, splintering fence posts and scattering feed. The dog lunged, wood cracked, and shots lit the night like angry fireflies. Nalin fought with unexpected ferocity, moving with desperate precision, firing and ducking, reloading with hands that trembled but did not fail, driven by the need to guard something irreplaceable. Elijah found old rhythms, footwork from dusty streets, measured breath, an aim that disabled rather than killed when he could choose it, and he covered angles and called where to fall back. They forced the probing party back, sending several riders stumbling and others limping away. But the price was a burned corner of the feed shed, splintered posts, and horses wounded in the morning's light. The men who lunched at the gate wore rough-handed and impatient, using torches to scout under porches and up at the loft, ripping a corner of the windmill ladder as if to test what would fall when pulled. And one of them reached for the lean-to where Nalin had crouched until Elijah stepped forward and sent her round into the dirt at his feet, biting a breath that kept her alive. Blood fell on Nalin's sleeve where a splinter had cut her arm, and she tasted copper and grit and still did not falter. Her jaw set like a stone keeper as she pushed a fallen board into a gap to slow a man who tried to slip through. The closest rider went down when Elijah sighted and fired to unseat him rather than to slay. And the scramble that followed was a mixture of shouts and the metallic clang of fear as men tried to regain order while sound and fury braided through the pitch of night. When the outlaws finally broke and rode off with curses and the slow accompaniment of wounded mounts, Elijah stood in the smoke and the scent of scorched hay and felt every inch of the ranch as if it were his own skin branded by the encounter. And in that raw moment he realized the promise of peace was no longer an option but a line drawn that demanded to be held. In the thin gray of dawn, Nalin crouched by the gate, wrapping a rag around a cut on her palm, eyes hollow with sorrow that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with grief and loss. When Boone's riders vanished into the range, the rails leaned like weary men, and Nalin asked of Elijah not for a badge, but whether he would stand with her when the real fight came. The morning after Boone's men tested the ranch arrived with a pale and reluctant dawn, a light that seemed almost ashamed to reveal the damage from the night before, and Elijah Carter stood in the yard with shoulders rigid, staring at the broken fences, the scattered feed, and the thin wisps of smoke curling from the blackened corner of his shed. Something inside him shifted with a weight he had not felt in years, not since the day he placed his sheriff's badge on a desk and walked away from Red Crossing with the ghosts of a dead boy trailing behind him. Yet as he surveyed the scars Boone's men had carved into his land, Elijah felt an old fire stirring beneath his ribs, not hot with vengeance but steady and grim like coals that once kept a man warm through the harshest winters. After a long, hard silence, he walked to the barn, every step deliberate, as if each footfall threaded him deeper into a past he promised himself he would never revisit. Nalin followed at a respectful distance, silent but watchful, understanding instinctively that some doors a man had to open alone. Elijah slipped behind a stack of tools, crouched, and lifted a loose floorboard, revealing a small wooden chest he had buried under years of dust and denial. Inside lay the relics of a former life, his Colt pistol, polished even by time, the rifle that had ended more violent than it started, and at the bottom, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, the badge that once announced him as Sheriff Elijah Carter of Red Crossing. His breath caught as he held it, feeling the cold metal bite through old scars, and for a moment he trembled, not from fear of Boone Maddox, but fear of himself, fear of the man he might become again if he chose this road. He set the badge down on a beam, staring at it with the haunted softness of someone grieving an identity, and Nalin stepped forward quietly, kneeling beside him without touching anything. She told him then, in a voice woven with cracked strength, about her own losses, their brother Boone murdered for defending their ancestors' resting places, the elders who died trying to protect sacred ground, the children who now lived with fear stitched into their hearts like a second skin. Her pain drifted into the barn like smoke, settling beside Elijah's old grief until their sorrows felt like twin shadows cast by the same cruel sun. Elijah looked at her, really looked, and saw not only fear or desperation but a raw endurance that mirrored his own, a willingness to carry the memory of the dead without letting it break her spirit. He felt something settle between them then, not a promise, not a vow, but an understanding born from two people who had been marked by tragedy and were tired of running from the echoes of their pasts. Slowly, with hands no longer trembling, Elijah holstered the Colt at his hip and slung the rifle across his shoulder, the movements fitting him like a forgotten rhythm returning to a seasoned dancer. Finally he picked up the badge, holding it one last time before slipping it into his pocket, not as a sheriff reclaiming authority, but as a man acknowledging that peace required more than hiding from the world. Nalin met his gaze, her eyes dark pools of gratitude and sorrow, and she whispered that her people had a word for those who defended the resting places of the ancestors, keepers of the bones, guardians of memory. Elijah felt the title settle on him heavier than any badge he ever wore, and though he said nothing, the look he gave her spoke clearly. The old sheriff had returned, not to chase justice for himself, but to stand with someone who knew what it meant to carry the dead. Elijah and Nalin left the ranch before dawn, riding into a landscape that seemed to listen as if the earth itself kept secrets. Nalin's mount moved with the quiet steadiness of one bred to find hidden trails, and Elijah kept close, watching the way she read the ground like a page. She told him, in short, deliberate sentences, of how her people once shared this land not as property but as a living ledger, waters, stones, and burial mounds marking stories that tied them to place, and how each feature held a name, a memory, a rule that kept people in balance with what fed and sheltered them. She spoke of the medicine springs tucked beneath layers of shale, of wind-carved alcoves where elders had laid offerings, of game paths worn into the earth by generations of hooves. And as she spoke, she pointed out small signs Elijah would have missed, a notch in a yucca limb where a crossing had been marked, a rounded stone smoothed by hands long gone. Petroglyphs half hidden by lichen told of journeys and births and losses. The more she spoke, the more the land stopped being anonymous scrub and became a map of relationships, who belonged where, who owed what to whom, and how the dead were kept near so the living would not forget. Elijah listened more than he spoke, feeling his old understanding of the Weston's pool, not just a place to own but a place that owned memory, a ledger Boone Maddox would never respect. Nalin told him about the elders who guarded the burial grounds, how they taught children to read the sky and the stones, how they placed offerings so the dead might walk in dreams and guide the living. She explained that Boone's men moved like a disease, arriving with greed and ignorance, taking bits of story and bone to sell to collectors who saw culture as curiosity and profit, not obligation. Along a dry wash they paused where the moon had cupped the earth into a shallow bowl, and Nalin dismounted, running fingers over a rock face where a spiral still held the black of age. She traced a line with her fingertip and spoke the name of an ancestor as if speaking it aloud gave the place strength. Elijah felt the words enter him like a tide, slow and inevitable. His old sheriff's world had taught him laws and lines on a map, but Nalin's voice taught him that some lines were older than any treaty and that trespass on them was a violence the law had no vocabulary for. At midday they skirted a ridge where wind had exposed a scatter of shards, pieces of pottery, a flake of obsidian, left like punctuation marks from lives lived here long before his kind drew property lines. Elijah dismounted and crouched, letting the small artifacts sit between his palms, feeling their weight as if they were not mere fragments but arguments for respect. He asked questions. How did the tribe decide who tended which place? How were disputes settled? What would happen if the grave was disturbed? And Nalin answered with patience and a firmness that made each answer land like a hand laid on a wound. She taught him a word for protection and another for remembering. She told him of ceremonies that were less spectacle than promise, acts that renewed obligations rather than performances for outsiders. As they rode on, the canyon walls closed around them and Nalin's voice grew louder, a chorus of history and hurt that stitched itself around Elijah's chest. He thought of Boone's lantern on the ridge, of men willing to burn and bargain and kill for what they could commodify, and he felt a hardening that was not anger alone but a dawning comprehension that what he was protecting was not a plot of ground but a people's living scripture. By the time they reached the outer circle of the Apache camps, Elijah's view had changed. He no longer saw just acreage and fences but places with names and obligations, and he knew Boone was not only after objects, he was after the right to rewrite a people's story for his own pockets. Their stories, she said, were not relics but instructions for living, warning, and remembering. Elijah listened and felt the land rewrite itself between his ribs. Elijah dismounted at the edge of the encampment and kept his hat low. Nalin walked forward without ceremony and the camp watched her return with guarded relief. Children paused their games and elders rose to stand in measured greeting. Trust in this place was not given lightly. It was ruled by memory and deed. They led the Perry to Dakota, the chief, who sat under a woven canopy. Dakota's hair was gray and his face was a map of winters and shortages. He listened as Nalin spoke plainly about Boone Maddox and his men. She described graves opened, stones taken, families threatened, and the bone fragments map. Dakota's eyes did not flash but narrowed like a blade being tested. He asked Nalin for facts and for names, not for drama. She gave them with steady breath, naming those heard and the route Boone used. Then Dakota turned his attention to Elijah then waited for the truth of his presence. Elijah answered without flourish, admitting he sheltered Nalin because he could not turn her away. He told of the raid on his ranch and the men he had seen on the ridge. He spoke plainly of his past as a lawman and of the cost that had driven him west. Some in the circle hardened at the name of a white man with a badge. Others watched for signs, small acts more telling than grand promises. Dakota spoke of history with a calm that carried harsh lessons. He listed the wrongs his people had suffered: trespass, theft, and broken treaties. Each example stroked Elijah's conscience like a cold wind across a scar. Nalin knelt and named those Boone had already wronged and those still in fear. The tribe reacted with quiet grief and a steady anger that warned of deeper measures. Dakota demanded proof that Elijah would not vanish once danger passed. He asked for deeds, patrols at night, shared watches, and honest labor at the boundaries. Elijah offered horses, food, and his hands to mend and defend what was sacred. He promised to ride to settlements and speak plainly with men who would trade in stolen relics. The council murmured and the women in the circle shared looks that weighed his offer. Nalin rose and spoke on Elijah's behalf, recounting small kindnesses and steadfast nights at the gate. Her voice bridged a gulf. It told the tribe this man was not the same as many outsiders. Dakota considered and then set terms: cooperation, but guarded and conditional. Elijah would be watched closely and taught rights he must honor. The tribe would not wholly trust him, but they would allow him to stand with them. He left the gathering with a fragile acceptance tightening like a new rope. Trust here would be earned slowly, measured in actions and respect, not words. Elijah understood that he now wore obligations as much as tools. He felt the weight and welcomed it, for this was no longer about land but memory. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. The alliance between Elijah and the tribe had barely settled into place when the desert wind carried in the first sign that Boone Maddox had moved from shadowing to striking, a foul shift in the air that made the ravens cry and the dogs in camp grow restless. At dawn, a young runner stumbled into Tecumseh's camp, breath ragged, eyes wide with a terror that no child should ever wear, and in his trembling hand he held a strip of leather cut from a bridle, one marked with the sun-etched braid of the tribe's two youngest scouts, Tahoma and Loyu, boys barely into manhood who had been sent to watch Boone's movements from a safe distance. But they had not returned, and the runner's broken words spilled out like stones hitting the ground, describing how he had seen Boone's men drag the boys into a canyon and string them from a jutting ledge where only their feet touched ground, leaving them exposed, beaten, and bound beneath a crude message pinned into the rock with a knife. Dakota tore the message free, jaw tightening as he read the scrawled threat written in Boone's coarse hand: "Give me the bone map, or I'll burn every inch of this land and bury the ashes with your sons." The camp erupted in grief and fury, warriors pacing like caged wolves, mothers clutching their children close, and even the stoic elders felt a crackle of the old rage that comes when the past repeats itself with cruel familiarity. Nalin's face went pale, her fists clenching around the cloth bundle that held the bone fragment, and Elijah felt a sick twist in his gut, not just at Boone's cruelty, which he had witnessed many times before, but at the cold precision of it. The way Boone knew exactly how to strike at the heart of a people who valued their young as sacred threads in a tapestry stretched back generations. Boone had not just taken hostages, he had issued a declaration of war. Dakota turned to Elijah, eyes dark with the storm building behind them, and asked in a voice both measured and shaking whether this was the kind of man the white law allowed to roam free. Elijah met his gaze with grim honesty, saying Boone cared nothing for law or treaty, only power and possession, and that as long as men like him believed no one would stand against them, they would continue carving through the living and the dead alike. The chief listened, heavy sorrow settling in the lines of his face, then announced to the tribe that though trust in Elijah was still fragile, they now faced a threat larger than any old wound or prejudice. Boone's ultimatum had tied their fates together like strands of the same rope. If the tribe fell, Elijah's land would follow, and if Elijah surrendered, the tribe's ancestors would be torn from the earth like weeds. In that moment, the fragile alliance hardened into necessity. Elijah stepped forward and offered not just assistance but action, volunteering to ride with a small party to scout Boone's camp, assess the boys' condition, and form a plan to retrieve them before the outlaw's deadline expired. Some of the warriors bristled at the idea of a white outsider joining them in a matter of tribal blood, but Nalin stood beside Elijah and spoke with a force that silenced the murmurs, telling them he had risked his life beside hers, fought off Boone's men, and treated the land with a reverence rare among settlers. Her words cut through resistance like a blade through old rope, and Dakota raised his hand, declaring that the ancestors did not care about skin but about action, about who protected the sacred ground and who threatened it. He placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder and called him a provisional ally, a title not given lightly, and with that, preparations began. Scouting horses saddled, weapons sharpened, watchers posted on the canyon rim. The tribe's grief simmered into resolve, and Elijah felt the old sheriff's instincts returning in full, driven not by duty to Apache but by loyalty to people who trusted him at their most vulnerable moment. Boone Maddox had drawn the line, and now they would answer, not with surrender, but with unity, a unity forged through fire, fear, and the shared knowledge that some threats could only be faced together. The days that followed Boone's ultimatum were a blur of urgency as great as Elijah, Nalin, and the Apache tribe transformed the narrow canyon entrance into a battleground Boone Maddox would not take without bleeding dearly for every step. From dawn until the last ember of dusk, the camp bustled like a hive preparing for a storm, warriors hauling stone, weaving brush, and carving footholds into the canyon walls so lookouts could move like shadows above the battlefield. Elijah walked the length of the canyon floor, boots crunching over gravel, studying angles and choke points with the practiced eye of a man who once arranged a town's defenses against far uglier foes. Though he had left the law behind, strategy still clung to him like an instinct sharpened by old failures, and Dakota soon realized Elijah's understanding of ambushes, routes of escape, and firing lines could mean the difference between life and massacre. After a quiet conversation with the elders, Dakota gave Elijah authority to coordinate the defensive plan, an unprecedented concession, but one born from necessity rather than trust. Elijah accepted with a solemn nod, knowing each decision he made would carry weight not only for himself but for a people who had survived centuries of broken promises. He directed warriors to roll large stones to the canyon mouth, stacking them into staggered barriers that would force Boone's riders into tight clusters. He showed younger fighters how to dig shallow trenches that would trip charging horses without being visible from a distance. He positioned experienced marksmen along the western ridge where the morning sun would blind approaching outlaws. All the while, he checked every path twice, whispering measures under his breath, thinking through Boone's likely maneuvers. The man favored intimidation first, misdirection second, and brutality always. Meanwhile, Nalin took upon herself a duty heavier than any weapon could match, guarding the burial site deep within the canyon's protected heart. She moved among the ancient stones and carved mounds with the reverence of one touching the pulse of her ancestors, humming low songs the elders had taught her, songs meant to call strength into sacred ground. She placed offerings of sage and river stones, whispering names she refused to let Boone's greed erase, and every so often she would glance toward the canyon entrance where Elijah worked, her eyes carrying both hope and fear. Hope that their preparations would hold, feared that even the strongest defense could be swept aside by Boone's cruelty. Elijah visited her once, carrying extra water, but lingered when he saw her kneeling before a carved stone that bore a spiral matching the one on her bone fragment. She explained it marked the resting place of a chief who had united tribes long before white settlers ever arrived, a man who believed land did not belong to people but that people belonged to their promises. Elijah bowed his head, feeling the weight of that truth settle into him like sand filling an old footprint. He told her he would not let Boone lay a hand on this place, not while breath remained in him, and Nalin's faint nod told him she understood the promise was not given lightly. Back at the canyon mouth, the tribe and Elijah worked with ferocity born of shared purpose, weaving branches into blinds, burying pots of sand to hinder movement, and constructing a false opening designed to funnel Boone's riders into a death trap. As night fell again and campfires glowed like scattered stars, Elijah stood watch over the entrance, rifle slung over his shoulder, feeling the tight coil of anticipation building in his chest. Boone Maddox was coming. The canyon was ready. And for the first time in years, Elijah Carter felt the old fire inside him burn without shame, not for revenge, not for redemption, but for the living and the dead who depended on him to stand his ground. Dawn cracked over the red canyon in a thin blade of light, slicing through the dust-hazed air just as Boone Maddox and his gang thundered toward the narrow entrance, their riders trailing a storm of hooves in fury that sent echoes ricocheting off the canyon walls like a war drum. Elijah stood at the fortified choke point with his rifle steady, eyes narrowed against the rising glare. Every muscle braced for the hit he knew was coming, while Apache warriors crouched along the ridges above, bows drawn and rifles glinting like the eyes of ancestral spirits watching from stone shadows. Boone raised his torch high in a show of arrogance before hurling it toward the canyon floor, and his men surged forward with a roar of men drunk on violence. But Elijah's trap sprung like a silent language. Trenches swallowed horses, rolling boulders forced the outlaws into tight clusters, and concealed warriors struck with disciplined precision. The first wave fell hard, cries cracking through the dust, yet Boone pushed his men deeper, firing wildly into the ridges, and the canyon erupted into chaos. Rock fragments flew, horses screamed, and smoke rose in twisting ribbons as the outlaws fought with desperation and ruthlessness. Elijah moved with practiced instinct, calling positions, firing measured shots, protecting both flanks as if stitching together a failing seam. He saw Dakota take a bullet to the shoulder, saw two of the tribe's warriors fall with arrows still clutched in their hands, and felt a surge of grim determination burn through him. But Boone, mounted on a broad black stallion, carved straight through the din, eyes locked on Elijah with a cold recognition of unfinished business, and he bellowed over the gunfire, "You should have stayed buried with the rest of your regrets, Sheriff." Elijah felt the old wound of that word, sheriff, open inside him. But instead of retreating, he stepped forward into the open, rifle discarded for the revolver at his hip, knowing the moment had come to face the part of his past he had tried to exile. Boone spurred his horse into a charge. Elijah fired twice, the shots cracking the morning air, the stallion bucking in panic as Boone leapt from the saddle and landed in a crouch where dust plumed around him like smoke from a forge. They circled each other, Boone wielding a long knife he had stolen from a burial site, its blade etched with symbols he did not deserve to touch, while Elijah carried only his pistol, nearly empty. Boone lunged with the ferocity of a starving predator, slashing and snarling, and Elijah dodged, each movement tapping into muscle memory carved by years of street fights and midnight standoffs. The clash spiraled closer to the canyon's heart, toward the burial grounds Nalin had sworn to protect. And when Elijah blocked Boone's knife arm with a forearm already bruised and bleeding, the outlaw sneered. "All this for bones and stories." Elijah answered with a blow that sent Boone stumbling back, growling that some stories were worth more than any man who dared to desecrate them. Boone recovered with frightening speed, tackling Elijah into the dirt, the knife grazing Elijah's ribs in a flash of white-hot pain. They grappled, trading blows that shook the ground beneath them, until Elijah, with a final desperate heave, rolled atop Boone and pinned the outlaw's knife rest against the earth. Boone roared and shoved back, spittle and rage mingling, but Elijah saw something in his eyes, a reflection of the destruction Boone reveled in, the very life Elijah had fled, and with a steadying breath, Elijah drove his fist across Boone's jaw, once, twice, until the knife fell free. Boone clawed for it, but Elijah seized it first, turned it, and drove the blade into the dirt beside Boone's head, pinning the outlaw's hair to the earth like a warning stake. The canyon had fallen to a eerie hush. Boone's remaining men fled or lay defeated, and Apache warriors emerged from smoke and shadow, battered but standing. Elijah rose slowly, chest heaving, staring down at Boone with the weight of every sin, every failure, every ghost he had carried. He did not need to kill the man to win. Boone had already lost everything. His power, his men, his grip on a land that had rejected him. And as Elijah turned to see Nalin standing near the burial stones, her eyes full of gratitude and grief, he knew that in defeating Boone, he had also confronted the broken pieces of himself, forging something new in the dust and blood of the Red Canyon. When Boone Maddox finally lay still beneath the canyon's red sky, he did so not with a boast but with the muffled sound of a man who had outlived his luck. Elijah Carter knelt over him, breath ragged, chest heaving where a blade had nicked bone and pride, and for a long moment the canyon held nothing but the low thump of distant hoofbeats as Boone's men realized their leader had been unmade and chose flight over ritual. The scatter of outlaws tore down the trail in ragged lines, horses lurching with panic, packs left swinging, and for every man who escaped the valley a handful of stories rode with him, stories that would carry Boone's name as a warning rather than an anthem. Around them the air smelled of gunpowder and crushed sage, and the earth itself seemed to exhale as if relieved that the violence which had rent it had finally been answered with force not born of greed. Elijah felt the world tilt under him. Pain bloomed where Boone's knife had found bone, but beneath it something steadier took root, a hard, weary certainty that he had stood where it mattered. Nalin was at his side in an instant, hands deft despite trembling, pressing cloth to the wound with a tenderness that was part medicine and part absolution, her fingers smelling of smoke and river stones and a kind of unshaken resolve Elijah had never seen in any courtroom or jailhouse. He watched her move toward the burial mounds that Boone's men had come to desecrate, and as she went she gathered the tribe with a quiet force that called the elders and mothers and warriors to a place of reckoning not built on revenge but on repair. Dakota stood tall though his shoulders still ached from the fight, and he lifted his voice in a language Elijah had come to hear as a map, each phrase a stitch mending a tear, each cadence a remembering. The tribe formed a ring around the stones Boone had threatened. They did not shout, they did not cheer. They walked with the measured feet of those who know grief and know too how fragile the peace can be once it is bought with blood. Nalin led, carrying the bone fragment wrapped in its leather, cradling it like a child or a talisman, and when she reached the central mound she set it gently upon the earth, fingers smoothing the dust as if smoothing a brow. She spoke names, not many, but the ones that mattered, ancestors whose stories were the backbone of the place, and the tribe answered with soft ululations and the low beat of drums that rose and fell like the canyon's own breathing. The ritual was lean and plain as the people who performed it, offerings of corn and baked squash, a scattering of river stones, the smoke of sage laurel that pulled to the sky as prayer. Elijah watched, feeling the ceremony pass through him like a tide that carried away something heavy, the hard shell of solitude he had wrapped himself in for years. He felt the eyes of the elders on him, not accusing now but measuring, and when Dakota approached he did not speak with the distrust of earlier days. Instead he pressed a small, smooth stone into Elijah's palm, a token of acknowledgement and a call to duty. "Keep the place," Dakota said, words that needed no translator, and in them lay the simplest contract Elijah had ever been given. Not ownership, not command, but guardianship. The tribe tended the graves with hands that moved like ritual knives, clearing, resetting, smoothing cairns till each mound looked as if it had been born yesterday, not torn apart by greed. Women sang low laments that braided sorrow into songs so the dead might hear and not be forgotten. Children set little flags and offerings, learning duties that would make them keepers of story when elders were no longer able. Nalin stayed by the bone fragment, sometimes weeping, sometimes smiling, and Elijah found himself at once comforted and ashamed. Comforted because the place he had agreed to protect was alive with those who held its code, ashamed because he had doubted that his return to arms could mean anything more than violence. But the ritual did more than comfort. It stitched the land back into community. And as the sun slid low, casting long red fingers across the stones, the elders declared a period of mourning followed by a long watch, a vigilance that would last seasons and would be shared between tribe and settler. Boone's remaining men would ride and tell their tales, and some would be caught by posses or left to rot in outlaw country. But in the canyon the reckoning was not measured by hangings or banners, it was measured by stones reset, by names restored to the tongues of children, by the quiet that settled over graves once more. Elijah sat with Nalin as the last of the drums wound down, his wound bound and his hands dirt-stained, and in the hush she told him what the elders had whispered earlier, that peace was not a place to be found but a habit to be kept, a daily choosing. He listened, feeling the old badge in his pocket as if it had grown warm with a new purpose, and when he stood to help lay the final stones he realized he would stay, not to relive the glories of the badge, not to chase justice in courts, but to be the kind of man who kept watch over a land and the memories it held. The canyon had taken its toll, and the canyon had given back a different, harder peace, a peace earned in blood, guarded by memory, sealed with a ritual that promised the dead would be remembered and the living would be bound to that remembering. In that binding Elijah found a new kind of redemption, not clean, not easy, but honest, and as stars pricked the dome of night, the land seemed at last to breathe in time with those who would protect it. Elaine Jakarta rode back to his ranch under a sky scrubbed clean by recent storms, the west wind carrying the faint scent of sage and a softness he had not allowed himself to trust in years. and as the familiar silhouette of his porch came into view, he felt the canyon behind him like a seam that had been stitched in wood. He hoped. Cold, the work there had been brutal and honest, and it had left him with aches that no salve could touch. But it had also given him something the years of quiet had not, a sense of belonging measured not by distance from his past but by what he chose to do with the present. He tethered his horse, walked up the worn steps, and paused with his hand on the rail, feeling the wood under his palm like an old companion. The house smelled of stew and smoke and the faint trace of sage that had clung to his clothes since the ritual, and in that ordinary domesticity he found a surprising clearness. Small things that had been trivial before now looked like proof that life could be rebuilt in gentler ways. Nalin came to visit within days, arriving on foot with sand still in the fold of her boots and the bone fragment wrapped safe beneath her shawl. And when Elijah opened the door to her, she did not step in immediately but stood on the threshold and offered him a nod that carried a dozen unspoken thanks and warnings. She told him with a soft, steady voice that the elders had agreed to a long watch and that Dakota had asked for a steady hand to help keep the boundary safe. Not his owner but his guardian. Because ownership had never been the point was care. They sat at the worn kitchen table and spoke of small, important things. How to repair a fence so it would not become an easy walk for rustlers. When to plant a windbreak row that would hold soil through the dry months. The names of the elders whose stories Elijah should learn to say properly. And Nalin taught him phrases that were not translations but invitations to remember. She told him that peace was not a place to arrive at like a town on a map but a practice to be chosen every day. Whether to stand when it is easier to look away. Whether to honor a grave by speaking its name. Whether to teach a child the stories that rooted people to place. And Elijah listened until the edges of his old shame smoothed a little. Because in her company his responsibilities did not feel like sentences but like tasks with meaning. The ranch needed tending, of course, livestock to check, fences to mend, the well to maintain, and Elijah found that the rhythm of work kept guilt from gaining too much headway. Each nail he drove felt like an agreement with the land. Each furrow he plowed a promise he could keep. He walked the boundary lines with Nalin and with a few tribal youths who had begun to trust him, pointing out markers, learning which cairns could be approached and which were to be skirted. And in these small lessons he felt himself become part of a different kind of law, one written in memory and mutual obligation rather than paper and signatures. Children from the camp sometimes came to the gate and watched him feed the horses, and he showed them how to curry a coat or mend a saddle. And when one of the boys asked if he would ever go back to being a sheriff, Elijah only smiled and said he would always be a man who tried to keep promises. It was a modest answer, but the children accepted it. And that acceptance mattered more than any badge. There were days when the old ghost surfaced, nights when he woke to the sound of gunfire in his head or to faces that had haunted him since Red Crossing. But those nights were different now. He had people to speak with, apologies to make that were not hollow, rituals to attend that mended rather than tore, and the knowledge that when grief came it could be shared and carried together. Boone's shadow receded as lawmen and posses picked off stragglers, or his story turned him into a cautionary tale passed along campfires. And though violence could never be fully exorcised from the land, its intensity had ebbed because a community had chosen to guard what mattered. Seasons turned, and when spring came the land showed itself in fragile green. And Elijah stood with Nalin at the fence line one morning watching a foal with a hesitant step find its legs in the grass and felt something like relief uncoil in his chest. He understood then that his decision to stay was not a surrender to the past but an embracing of responsibility. In the afternoons he would help the tribe with chores and in the evenings they would share food and stories. The old mistrust between settler and native softened into routine respect, and Takoti's nod in the communal circle became as meaningful to him as any official word he had once sought. Nalin visited often, sometimes to teach, sometimes to grieve aloud for losses not easily named, and each visit tightened a bond built on work and respect rather than pity. He kept the badge in a drawer now, not discarded but kept as a reminder of what he had been and what he chose to be. No longer the lawman who judged from a desk but the neighbor who stood to watch. Peace, Nalin said once as dusk folded over the ranch and the first stars pricked the sky, is a choice you make when no one sees you. And Elijah thought of all the small choices he had made since Boone's shadow fell, to answer the gate, to mend a gravestone, to teach a child a name. He had come west to hide and found instead a life knotted to people and land that asked him to remember. The quiet he had once sought was not the absence of trouble but the presence of duty fulfilled. He would stay, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he now knew that the only lasting peace was one earned daily by hands that worked, hearts that remembered, and a promise kept at the gentle insistence of those who would trust him with their stories. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.